Hi, Stuart here. Thanks for watching. In this video, we're going to have a quick look at getting from A to B. So in other words, what a learning episode might look like in a responsive teacher's classroom. So once we are really clear on what it is exactly that we're teaching in this learning episode and what it is that we expect students to be able to do by the end of that learning episode, and we're confident that the group has all of that essential prerequisite knowledge, then we can look in detail at getting from A to B. Now, this flowchart, as I said, is a possible model of what this might look like in a responsive teacher's classroom. So as I said, what's really important from the outset is that we are sure that the group we're working with has all that prerequisite knowledge in place and is ready to start learning this new content. So we can break this diagram down into a few sections. First of all, the teacher's introduction, that exposition, where we're trying to sort of set the scene and make connections to things that students already know. And then we would move into this sort of initial phase of instruction, where at this point, the new content is exactly that to the students. It's completely new, and so this would be largely teacher-led, explicit instruction, maybe through examples. And we can see that we'd move into this sort of scaffolded practice phase, so sometimes called the we do phase, where students might work in pairs or a bit of close teacher supervision as they're just starting to sort of replicate what it is the teacher is showing them to do. So throughout that process, the teacher can assess. Formative assessment strategies that are used here would be perhaps questioning, but also whole class assessment, maybe using those mini whiteboards to get a sense of how everyone's doing, and also, of course, close monitoring of student work. And as long as everybody's ready, then we can maybe move on to the next phase. But we may well find that if we're not ready, we go back and we sort of re-instruct and we pick out elements of the example just to make sure that everybody is on that same page. So moving on from that very initial phase, once everybody's ready, this is where we start to devolve the responsibility more to the students, and the teacher might do an example themselves and then expect students independently to complete a similar example, that sort of I do, you do type structure. Now, whilst that's going on, the teacher's job, a responsive teacher, would be continually assessing and looking at all of the students in the group to see how well they were picking up this new idea and what they were producing. So again, this may well be done on many whiteboards, and then there's a great opportunity for a responsive teacher to get a whole class response and to make a decision about whether the group is ready to move on. Now, when the group is ready to move on, there'll be a choice here. We might have more examples to do, and so in that case, we might go back to a slightly different type of example, maybe go back to scaffolded practice before then moving back on to that more independent practice. So that cycle could continue until we've worked through our sequence of examples. And then once the teacher has been using the formative assessment strategies, again, like many whiteboards, but also now perhaps using something like a hinge question, then we can start to make the decision, is the group ready to move on to independent practice? Now, in an ideal world, everybody moves on to independent practice at the same time. But in reality, that's probably not going to be the case. There may be one or two students or a subset of the group who need a little bit of corrective teaching. So at that point, what's happening is kind of two little subgroups are formed in the class. One group is moving on to independent practice, and the other group, individuals, are working with the teacher, either one-to-one or in a one-to-small group setting, on some corrective teaching, maybe doing some more modelling, another example, some additional scaffolding, to get all of those pupils ready to move towards independent practice. Now, this is sometimes where I can see problems when I'm visiting classes and in lessons, because if the independent practice is not appropriate, then a lot of those students who are largely left on their own at this point will become stuck. And that's why the practice that we give needs to align well with the examples that we've just done before them. So corrective teaching is over, and the whole group is now on to independent practice. But the teacher's job hasn't finished, of course, because we're now forensically assessing around the room, looking at those students, seeing what they're producing, corrective teaching as required. Maybe it's just a hint, a prompt. Maybe there's a few students that have all come up with some misconception. They've all formed the same misconception. So pull those students together whilst the others are still practicing, try and bust that misconception, maybe use a different model, and eventually we'll get to the point where everybody's working through that independent practice, and they're then completing it and they're ready to move on to the next stage. Now, not everybody will be ready at the same time yet again, so some students can be released onto enrichment work. Now, this doesn't have to be a brand new activity every lesson. It doesn't even have to relate directly to the material that's just been practiced. It could just be picking up on a task that they've been working on for the last week or more, and just continuing to work on that task, some sort of low floor, high ceiling tasks that students can work independently on. Or, of course, it could be tied to the work that's been done today, but often better to provide enrichment of material that's related but has come earlier in the learning sequence, just to deepen that understanding and see more of those connections. So the teacher's working busily, working with individuals or small groups during independent practice, providing that corrective teaching is required, but then eventually everybody can move on to that enrichment phase. And at that point, then we can decide whether we want to introduce another enrichment task, or maybe we move on to the next stage in the learning episode.